It's the 14th of February 1939 at the Blohm and Voss shipyard in Hamburg, and more than 60,000 people are standing along the banks of the Elbe to watch a battleship touch water for the first time. A woman named Dorothy von Loewenfeld steps forward to break the christening bottle across the bow. She is the granddaughter of Otto von Bismarck, the chancellor this ship carries into the world, and Adolf Hitler stands at the microphone to deliver the naming speech in his honor. It looks like a tribute to a great man. It is actually something else. Otto von Bismarck has been dead for 41 years. The hull sliding down the ways in front of his name does not yet have the raked bow that will one day make her the most recognizable warship on Earth. Her true weight has already been hidden from the very treaty that was supposed to limit her. And the design underneath that fresh gray paint was drawn up a generation before this launch day, built on bones borrowed from battleships meant for an older war. 18 more months of work still stand between this crowd and a ship that can actually fight. This is the story of the shipyard on the Elbe, the welders, and the machines that built the Bismarck. 4 years and 196.8 million Reichsmarks before she was ever truly finished. 3 years before that crowd gathered along the Elbe, the same stretch of the Blohm and Voss yard in Hamburg held nothing but an empty building berth and a stack of steel plates waiting to become a keel. On July 1st, 1936, that keel went down on Slipway 9, a berth the yard workers called Helgen IX. The hull under construction there carried a plain administrative name long before it ever carried a battleship's name. Yard number BV509. No christening, no crowd, no chancellor's granddaughter with a bottle of champagne. Just a construction number, a length of greased timber ways, and the first section of steel lowered onto the blocks by the yard's own cranes. This is where a battleship actually begins. Not at a launch and not at a naming ceremony with a head of state at the microphone, but at a single keel plate on a slipway, years before anyone outside the yard gates has a name to attach to it. Blohm and Voss was one of the largest shipbuilders in Germany, and Hamburg's stretch of the Elbe was built for exactly this kind of work. Even so, laying a keel is a slow, unglamorous business. There is no launch day crowd for it, there is no speech. There is a construction number stamped on a set of drawings and a crew that starts joining plate to plate and frame to frame along a length of more than 2 football fields, one section at a time. There is no footage anyone saves of a keel laying. No photographer waits along the Elbe for it the way 60,000 people would wait for the launch 3 years later. And yet everything that would eventually make Bismarck famous, or infamous, was decided right here on Helgen IX, in the quiet part of the story that history skips past in a single sentence. 2 years and 2 months of that steady, unphotographed work turned an empty berth into a recognizable warship. By September of 1938, the hull was structurally complete up through the upper deck, framed and plated and standing on the ways in the rough shape of the vessel the world would eventually know. 26 months to get a keel to that point, nearly 2 more years after that before she could fight in a war. And here is the part almost nobody notices when they look at the finished ship. The blueprints that hull was built from were not new. Bismarck's design descended directly from the Baden and Bayern class, battleships drawn up for an entirely different war. 4 twin gun turrets, not the triple turrets the rest of the world's navies were already moving toward. A hull framing scheme that naval architects Garsky and Dulin later examined and judged closer to 1918 practice than to 1936. The battleship the world would come to fear was, underneath her new steel and her fresh gray paint, running on an architecture nearly 20 years old. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. Every Navy rebuilding under treaty limits in the 1930s faced the same fork in the road. Gamble on an unproven modern layout, or fall back on a design that had already been tested, refined, and understood down to the last seam. Blohm and Voss and the naval architects behind this hull chose the safer BET. It cost nothing in prestige on the day the keel went down. Nobody at Slipway 9 in 1936 stood up to object that the ship's bones belonged to her grandfather's navy rather than her own. So why build the most feared battleship of a new war out of a blueprint from the last one? Because a proven design fails less often than a new one. And in 1936, nobody at Blohm and Voss was in a position to gamble a hull this expensive on an architecture nobody had ever tested at sea. That choice, made quietly and made permanently in the summer of 1936, would sit underneath every later decision made on this hull, every argument about what she could and could not survive. From that slipway in the summer of 1936, the finish line looks close. It is not. 4 years stood between this keel and a ship ready to sail into a war, and the hull rising on the waves was only the first half of that clock. Even after she left the slipway and touched the Elbe for the first time, roughly 18 more months of work would remain before she was anything more than an empty, unarmed shell with a famous name painted on her stern. The keel laying was not the hard part. The launch, when it came, would not be the hard part either. The hard part was the year and a half that came after, the part nobody standing in a launch day crowd ever thinks to ask about. That means the crowd along the Elbe, when it finally gathered, would be cheering something closer to a milestone than a finish line. A ship this size does not go from an empty berth to a warship ready for war in one leap. It goes through stages, and the stage after the launch would turn out to take almost as long as the stage everyone was about to watch happen on Slipway 9. That story belongs later, to the months after she touched water. Right now on Slipway 9 in the summer of 1936, the only thing that mattered was steel, and how that steel was going to be joined together. Because a hull this size does not rise out of a drawing. It rises out of a decision about welds and rivets, made early and made permanently, one that was about to make this battleship stranger and lighter than anyone watching her keel go down could have guessed. For generations, warship hulls had been riveted together, plate after plate, hundreds of thousands of red-hot rivets hammered into place by hand along the Elbe and every other shipyard in the world. Riveting was slow, it was loud enough to deafen a man over a career, and it worked in exactly the way everyone in the industry already understood. Blohm and Voss did not build this hull that way. Roughly 90% of it was welded instead, seams of molten steel fused directly to steel with no rivet heads standing proud of the surface at all. This is not how a battleship is supposed to look in anyone's imagination. Picture a warship from this era, and the image that comes to mind is almost always a hull stitched together with rivets, rows of them marching down every seam, because that is how it had almost always been done for as long as steel warships had existed. Walk the ways beside this hull in 1937, though, and you would see something closer to a single continuous shell of steel, the joints smooth rather than studded, the welder's torches tracing lines down the plating where a riveting gang would once have stood. The whole surface reads less like something bolted together and more like something poured in one piece. The reason was not elegance, it was weight. A welded seam does the same structural job as a riveted one using less steel, because there is no need for the overlapping plates, the double thickness at every joint, and the rows of rivet heads that a riveted connection requires. Multiply that saving across the length of an entire hull, seam after seam, deck after deck, and the number stops being trivial. Every ton not spent joining plates together is a ton available somewhere else on the ship. The question on Slipway 9 was never really about the welding torch itself. It was about where all those saved tons were going to go. Some of it went into subdividing the ship for survival. The hull was split into 22 separate watertight compartments, sealed off from one another so that flooding in one section would not automatically spread into the next. Beneath that, a double bottom ran the length of the hull almost from bow to stern, roughly 83% of it, a second steel skin standing between the sea and the ship's vital spaces. None of this was decoration. A hull this size, carrying this much weight above the waterline, needed every one of those compartments doing its job correctly the first time it was tested, because there would be no second attempt at building it once she was afloat and at war. And a great deal of the saved weight went straight into armor, because armor on a battleship is not a detail. It is close to being the entire point of the ship. The belt running along her sides was made of Krupp Cemented steel, 320 millimeters thick at its heaviest, standing 4.8 meters tall and stretching 170.7 meters down her hull, covering roughly 70% of her waterline. Behind that belt sat a 50 millimeter backing of ordinary teak, plain shipbuilding timber doing the unglamorous job of absorbing shock so the steel in front of it did not simply crack under impact. The belt itself was angled outward where it passed the turrets, tilted just enough to make an incoming shell more likely to glance off than punch straight through. Add up every plate of it, deck armor included, and the total came to 19,082 metric tons of steel. That is roughly 40% of the entire ship's designed fighting weight walking around encased in armor before a single gun, boiler, or crew member is even counted. So the welding decision did exactly what it was supposed to do. It bought back the tonnage that all of that armor and all of that internal subdivision cost, plate for plate, ton for ton. On paper, that arithmetic should have kept the ship comfortably inside the limit Germany itself had agreed to only a year earlier. It did not. Under the 1935 Anglo-German Naval Agreement, Germany had accepted a hard ceiling on ships exactly like this one. 35,000 tons, standard displacement, full stop, signed and put on the record. This hull, once every compartment, every plate of armor, and every system was accounted for, came in at roughly 41,700 tons. That figure is not a rounding error. It is a battleship built more than 6,000 tons over the number Germany itself had committed to in writing before a single plate of this hull was welded, and that gap was not an accident discovered after the fact. It was known inside the yard for the entire span of the build, and it was kept off the record the whole time. The welding torch had not simply made a lighter battleship possible. It had made a heavier one deniable, at least for as long as nobody outside Hamburg could climb aboard and check. None of this came cheap, and the bill tells its own version of the story. Building this hull, arming it, armoring it, and fitting it out from a bare keel to a finished warship cost 196.8 million Reichsmarks, the single most expensive warship Germany had ever put into the water, edging out even her own sister ship being built at the same time at a different yard. It is an enormous sum, and it belonged to a ship that, on paper, was not supposed to weigh what she weighed, cost what she cost, or exist in the shape she existed in. Step back from the Slipway now and the whole picture starts to come into focus. A hull welded instead of riveted to save weight nobody outside the yard gates could see or measure. That saved weight poured straight into armor thick enough to shrug off a shell and into a double bottom built to survive being torn open from below. And all of it stacking up, ton by hidden ton, into a displacement figure that quietly broke the one number Germany had promised the rest of the world it would never cross. Every clever decision made on this slipway, the welding, the compartments, the belt, the teak backing, had bought exactly enough room to hide the one number that mattered most. The steel here was honest. It did the job it was engineered to do, seam by seam, exactly as designed. The paperwork was not. And the hull sitting on those blocks in Hamburg, for all its welded seams and its hidden tonnage, was still missing the machinery that would let any of that steel actually move, let alone fight. The steel could not move on its own. Everything that had gone into this hull so far, the welded seams, the hidden compartments, the armor thick enough to shrug off a shell, still added up to a very large object sitting still on a slipway. Moving her, fighting her, keeping her fed with steam and electricity for weeks at sea, needed a different kind of machine entirely, and Blohm and Voss built that machine too, buried deep inside the hull where nobody at a champagne ceremony would ever think to look. 12. Wagner boilers ran the length of her lower decks, ultra-high pressure units burning oil instead of coal, engineered to push steam through the system at pressures near the outer edge of what German industry could reliably build in the late 1930s. That steam fed 3 separate sets of turbines, built by Blohm and Voss's own engineering works rather than bought in from an outside supplier, each set geared down to drive one of 3 propeller shafts running aft through the hull toward the stern. 3 shafts, 3 propellers turning independently of one another so that damage in one system would not necessarily silence the rest. None of this sat in open view. It sat below the waterline, behind bulkheads, under decking, in compartments that would never once be photographed for a newsreel. By the standards of 1939, it was about as advanced a steam plant as any navy on Earth was putting to sea, and it was being lowered piece by piece into a hull whose framing scheme naval architects would later judge closer to 1918 practice than to 1936. That contradiction was real, and on launch day it was as invisible as everything else the ship was hiding. If a story like this is worth your time, subscribing costs nothing and keeps documentaries like it coming every week. By February of 1939, none of that mattered yet to the 60,000 people standing at the water's edge in Hamburg. They could not see the boilers, they could not see the turbines, they could not see the welded seams or the 6,000 tons of hidden displacement or the design studies that would one day call this hull a product of the First World War wearing a late 1930s coat of paint. All they could see was a battleship, enormous, gray, finished looking, sitting on the ways above the Elbe, waiting for someone to let it go. At 1 o'clock on the afternoon of February 14, 1939, That someone was a woman most of the crowd had likely never heard of before that day. Dorothy von Löwenfeld climbed the christening platform as the granddaughter of Otto von Bismarck, the man the ship was named for, a man who had been dead for 41 years by the time she swung the bottle against the bow. Adolf Hitler stood beside her and delivered the naming speech himself. Whatever he said that afternoon about German engineering and German ambition, he said it over a hull that was, in several very specific ways, nobody standing in that crowd could check for themselves, not yet the ship it appeared to be. 60,000 people is a lot of witnesses for a lie nobody in the crowd could actually catch. Every one of them was looking at a finished-looking battleship named for a dead statesman, and not one of them could see the compartments, the concealed tonnage, the treaty already broken in secret, or the machinery running through her hull that made all of it possible. The bottle broke, the crowd cheered, the ship slid down Slipway 9 and into the Elbe exactly on schedule, and every single person watching believed they had just seen the finished article. Watch the newsreel footage today and the ship in it looks almost, but not quite, like the Bismarck everyone recognizes. The bow is wrong. Every photograph taken of her afterward, every model kit, every documentary poster since, shows a raked, knife-edged prow cutting forward at an angle, the single shape that has become shorthand for the ship itself. That is not the bow that slid down Slipway 9 that afternoon. She was launched with her original stem, straight and nearly vertical, the ordinary profile of a German battleship of her generation, because the raked Atlantic bow had not been built yet. Nobody standing at the water's edge that day was looking at an unfinished ship. They were looking at a different ship entirely, one whose most famous feature simply did not exist yet. It would be cut away completely during fitting out, months after the crowd had gone home and the newsreel cameras had packed up, and replaced with the profile that every image of the Bismarck now assumes she was born with. That bow did not exist yet on the day the world first saw her. She did not sail out of Hamburg that afternoon either. A launch only moves a hull off the slipway and into the water. It does not arm it, finish its superstructure, wire its systems, or make it capable of anything beyond floating. For roughly the next year and a half, she sat not in some dedicated dry dock built to service a ship her size, because no such dock at the yard was finished yet, but tied up at the ordinary equipping pier, cranes swinging turrets and fittings aboard her while welders and riggers who had never been photographed for a newsreel finished the ship the cameras had already declared complete. That work, the fitting out, ran right up to her commissioning on August 24, 1940, 4 years, almost to the month, after her keel had first touched Slipway 9, nearly as long again as it had taken to build the hull itself. So look again at what 60,000 people actually watched that day. A dead man's name carried across the bow by his own granddaughter's hand. A hull built to a design naval architects would later place closer to 1918 than to 1936, hiding compartments and armor clever enough to make up the difference. A displacement figure that broke a treaty in writing while nobody outside the yard gates could check the arithmetic. And a bow that in every photograph anyone would ever take of the ship afterward was not even attached yet. The most famous battleship in the world had just been introduced to the public wearing a face she had not grown into, riding on machinery nobody in the crowd could see, 4 years and 196.8 million Reichsmarks deep into a story that was, on its own launch day, still unfinished. Unfinished was not a metaphor. What slid into the Elbe that afternoon in February 1939 could float and little else. Everything that made her a warship rather than an enormous gray hull still had to be built into her, and that work went on for 18 more months at the yard's ordinary equipping pier, a few hundred meters from where the champagne had broken, out of sight of any newsreel camera that had already packed up and moved on to the next story. Somewhere inside those 18 months came the work on that bow. The raked prow she is remembered for was not reshaped from the straight stem she had launched with. It was an entirely new section of hull, built separately away from her, then floated into position and welded onto a hull that had already been sitting in the Elbe for months without it. None of that work happened in a facility built to receive her. Blohm and Voss was constructing a graving dock large enough for hulls exactly her size, 351 meters long, 59 meters wide, a base in the yard called Elbe 17. It was not ready. Construction on Elbe 17 would not finish until 1942, 2 years after this ship was commissioned. She was built in part for a dock that did not yet exist in finished form, fitted out instead at the same ordinary pier used for every other large hull the yard had ever launched, and she never lived long enough to tie up inside the dock meant for her. Elbe 17 stood there unfinished for the entire span of her working life and only ever served other ships built by other men after she was gone. There is one number this story cannot give you, and pretending otherwise would break every rule the rest of it has followed. Every figure so far, the tonnage, the cost, the boiler pressures, the length of the armor belt, traces back to a surviving yard document, a naval architect's later study, or an account somebody wrote down at the time and somebody else preserved decades later. The count of workers killed building this ship at Blohm and Voss between 1936 and 1940 does not exist in any record that has surfaced. 4 years of welding a hull this size, hoisting armor plates weighing tens of tons apiece, and lowering gun turrets into a ship already sitting afloat on the Elbe is not gentle work, and it would be naive to assume nobody was hurt or killed doing it. But no confirmed figure survives in the sources this account was built from, and inventing one or quietly borrowing a number from some other shipyard's history to fill the silence would be exactly the kind of concealment this whole story has been built around exposing. Other great ships have a documented body count attached to their build. This one honestly does not. Not because nobody was hurt, but because nobody who could tell us wrote it down in a way that lasted. So this account leaves that number blank rather than manufacture the one figure it cannot verify. She was commissioned on August 24, 1940, 4 years after her keel first touched Slipway 9, and 196.8 million Reichsmarks after Germany decided to build her at all, the most expensive warship the country had ever produced, edging out even her own sister ship. What left Hamburg that month carried a bow manufactured after her own launch. The same hidden tonnage and outdated bones the launch day crowd had cheered without seeing, and armor and machinery nobody in that February crowd had been allowed to look at. None of it was finished the day 60,000 people cheered her. All of it, the welded seams, the concealed weight, the bow bolted on after the cameras left, the dock built for her that she never used, was built, cut, welded, and hidden into place by the men and the machines at one shipyard on the Elbe working through a war already gathering around them. That is what 4 years at Blohm and Voss actually built, not the 3 days at sea everyone already knows about. The yard, the machines, the men who never got a launch day of their own.